Great, let's get started then. Thanks so much for coming this afternoon. Today's presentation is, getting your first book published. So, if this is the meeting that you intended to come to, then you're in the right place. Otherwise, you might want to rethink it. One thing before I get started, and it has to do with this unfortunate picture because it's been pointed out to me before. No, that book is not upside down on my shelf. That's actually the way we printed it. Actually won a design award, the Poisoning of Michigan, back in 2009, so that was intentional. Now, I'll start with a preamble first, even though that slide is diving into things. This is just to give you some context and some background. Right now, there are 140 members of the Association of American University Presses. And not counting those presses that are tied to foundations or societies, there are about 100 university presses that actively seek manuscripts. Currently, the combined backlist of just those presses that are operating in North America are about 140,000 titles. In 2007, those 100 presses issued almost 10,100 new books. By 2012, the number was nearly 12,000, and today that's almost 14,000 books a year, plus 900 scholarly journals. However, note that there are close to 2,000 institutions of higher learning in the United States, and that a significant majority of these institutions require that their humanities and social science faculties publish. This implies that about 100 university presses and their home institutions are in fact subsidizing at least 1,000 other universities and colleges who are sort of, if I can use the term, free riders on a system that they rely upon but which they do not support. Also, having said that, here's a sobering thought from the Smithsonian.com, quote, about 1.8 million scholarly articles and scientific papers are published each year in 28,000 journals. As many as half of these articles are not read by anyone beyond the author and the journal's editor, and 90% of these articles are not cited in any other paper. So you're looking at a lot of competition to get noticed. So getting started, first of all, is what you're considering a completely new work, or are you revising a dissertation? I need some technical help. My little thingy isn't working now. How do I get the next slide?
You need to get rid of that thing. Click that thing. That thing.
What do I need to get rid of?
Yeah, we're accustomed to just hitting the down arrow, aren't we? And it didn't
Right.
work.
All right, good. Perfect. There's lots and lots of books out there. You'll find them going on Amazon, Kong, or Googling. What I've done is, and there's a handout here if you want to pass it around. This is a selection of books that various sources and various authors have indicated as some of the best books to give you indications on how to go forward. The first one by Robert Derencourt, The Author's Guide to Scholarly Publishing. It brings a tremendous amount of knowledge to the subject. William Germano, Getting It Published, a guide for scholars and anyone else serious about serious books. It addresses questions like, why does an editor choose some books and decline others? How does a writer decide where to submit a project? How does the peer review process work? And so forth. Again, by Germano, From Dissertation to Book. This is a classic. The focus here is on the revision and the revisioning process. It's got excellent tips on how to approach the problem of turning your dissertation into a publishable work. Beth Louie has two books. Well, first is The Handbook for Academic Authors, published by Cambridge in '95. It's very clear and informative. It covers revising the dissertation, finding and working with a publisher, and the mechanics of authorship. This is maybe the best overall guide to the topic. Oh, by the way, I also chose specifically books that are all available here in the library, except you're probably going to rush to get them. I've got them right now, but I'll turn them in tonight and you can find And Beth Louie, Revising Your Dissertation, Advice from Leading Editors. This is really practical advice about how to turn it in. They're all very straightforward. They're all written from the point of view of people that have done this kind of work for years and years, and I think you'll find them really helpful. Here's a checklist that I took down from the difference between the dissertation and the book, and this comes from the Germano book that I mentioned earlier. So we're on the one hand, a dissertation fulfills an academic requirement. A book fulfills a desire to speak broadly. The audience for the dissertation is your committee. The audience for your book, hopefully, is thousands of people that you don't know. The dissertation rehearses scholarship in the field, whereas the book has absorbed that scholarship and builds on it. The length of a dissertation is unlimited. A book's length has to be strategically controlled for its marketability, obviously. Depending on the quotations, it's often in blocks of cited material, whereas a book has to use quotes and citations judiciously. A dissertation hides the authorial voice. The book needs to create and sustain one. The structure of a dissertation demonstrates analytical skills. The structure of a book demonstrates a through line. Now, this word, which Germano uses, comes from acting theory, and it has to do with sustaining in a linear fashion the parabola and the arc of what your narrative is going to be, because even a scholarly book has a narrative, obviously, at a point. The examples in a dissertation are numerous, sometimes necessarily repetitive. Those in a book have to be chosen very, very carefully and only illustrate the points. You have a few long chapters in a dissertation, several chapters of readable length in a book, and finally, a dissertation simply stops, whereas a book needs to conclude. It needs to come to a point. Things not to do, and this is again from Germano's checklist, and I think this is very handy. Never assume that a dissertation is already worthy of being a book. Never assume that a publisher or reader will treat a first book as a practice exercise. Never submit a manuscript deceptively. If it's going to more than one publishing house at the same time, say so. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later. Never conceal from a potential publisher arrangements that you've already made for the publication of chapters in journals or edited volumes in print or online. Never send a manuscript to a publisher unless you've been asked to do so by the publisher, because it's just going to be parked somewhere, obviously. And never assume that an award-winning scholarly book couldn't have begun as a dissertation. Types of publishers, and this I think is something very interesting to consider and to look at. University presses, this is for scholarly work, of course, even scholarly work that you intend to go into the hands of a general readership. So the choices are university presses, commercial academic presses, or trade publishers. Here's the very basic differences. So a university press, its main distinguishing feature is that the process that they use to select the manuscripts. They have a very elaborate system of in-house review by the editors themselves, outside peer referees, and a faculty review board that has to approve the entire process. The UPs will place greater emphasis on substantial amounts of editing and copy editing, as well as higher standards of design and production. The commercial, or sometimes called professional scholarly publishers, usually work in a more profitable field of STEM research, but in the case of the humanities, where they will publish, they'll do large reference works or multi-volume editions. Their selection process may be similar to that of a university press, but without faculty review committees. And while some commercial publishers are highly reputable, at many the peer review is only pro forma. In other words, they'll get a letter of recommendation from someone in the field that says, sure, it's fine, go forward. A very few commercial scholarly publishers will do editing at the same level that a university press does, but most only do minimal editing and very basic design. The advantage of commercial publishers is their speed. Their large disadvantage, they'll get you into print much, much faster. Their disadvantage is that they need to seek profitability. So they often target a small, very specific audience, usually institutional purchasers, and their price of the books is very, very high for that reason. Trade publishers, finally, they target a more general educated readership, and they can actually sell vast numbers of copies. The author usually has to approach these people through an agent. Unsolicited manuscripts are rarely considered at a trade house. Their reviewing process can vary widely. They're usually pro forma, but they're much faster. Trade houses have a much larger marketing budget, so that's an enormous advantage. Prestigious trade houses generally carry the same consideration with university administrators as a UP does, so if you're thinking about tenure review and career advancement. However, run-of-the-mill trade houses do not have that kind of prestige. Be sure to get advice from your administration before going forward with that kind of option. And only consider this option if you are genuinely convinced that the work that you're doing will appeal to a very broad audience outside of academia. So that's sort of the breakdown. Now, let's survey the landscape. First, researching which publishers are most interested in your field or fields, especially if you're doing multidisciplinary work, and getting an overview of a press's current activity by visiting exhibit tables at major conferences. This is very important. Let's get a start on the first part, finding the right press for your manuscript. So, place to go, first of all, is www.aaupresses.org. Here's the home page. They've changed their name, by the way. It used to be AAUP, which was the same acronym as the Association of University Professors. They've now changed that, taken out the American in it. Now it's the Association of University Presses. But there's their website, www.aaupresses.org. Where you want to look there is over here, resources for authors and faculty. Once you get there, under resources, you'll get finding a publisher. And what you're going to want to look at is this wonderful downloadable subject area grid. And I've prepared a handout of that for you as well, so you don't need to get too far in advance of that. If you want to pass that around, this can be very, very handy. Now, you'll see the way that works is, and this is updated every year, and it's important to look at it because the presses themselves update their information every year. What you'll see on the grid is it's 10 pages long, 28 presses per page. They're in alphabetical order, and they have all the subject areas. And the balls are very important to notice. The white balls are books that exist in their catalog, but they haven't been actively publishing in recent years. So that's important to note. The black ones, and this goes on all the way from, in this case, African studies down to South American history, and then the next page is immigration all the way down to urban studies. Of course, it's an overview. It's not every possible subject, but it's the main subject areas. The black balls is the ones where the press is currently actively acquiring in those areas. So that's a first very handy place to look. But don't stop at that. The next thing you'll want to do is to actually go to each press site itself. So let's go back to the home page again. And this time, where you're going to want to look is press websites. Click here. And there you'll find the whole long listing of almost all 140. There's a geographical listing as well. I'll wait until you've handed out there and gotten everything settled. And here you'll find each press's website. Very important to get into a press's website to see where they are currently active. You might have in mind a press that has published a book that you use in your own teaching and has become, let's say, a standard in the industry, but it might be from 10, 12 years ago. If an acquisitions editor has moved on, if they have new people, or if their areas of interest have changed slightly because they published too much in one area, it's important to look at the website and see in your particular field and what you're thinking of moving forward so that you don't access 50 different presses at the same time, an immense amount of effort. What have they been publishing the last 5 or 6 years? What direction are they going in? And then finally, as I mentioned earlier, extremely important, once you have taken a checklist of those presses that you think would be just right for what you're trying to present and what you're trying to bring forward, go to your conventions, go to your book exhibit areas. Many scholars don't. Many scholars will go to a conference, they're too busy, they have too many people to meet, too many papers to listen to, and they'll just take a cursory run through the exhibit area. In this case, if you're thinking about presenting a book, your walk through the exhibit area should be targeted on seeing what are the latest books out in your field. Because this can work in two ways. One is you'll see what the current interest is in your area at a press, but you'll also see if maybe they've published too much of it. Sometimes your book may be kindly turned down because they've just done 2 or 3 books just in a very similar area, and they don't want to keep harping on that one field. But there's a broad range of people to choose from. So how do you get your book noticed? Well, first thing, do your homework just as you would when you're applying for a job. Once you've chosen these presses and you want to have a look, is their list area dated, as I just said? Is it rather small? Do they exhibit at your meetings? That's very important. That might mean they have only a few titles in the area that you're interested in, and you may not be able to reach with your book, even if they publish it, as many people as you hoped. In this case, also, use the word of mouth of your colleagues to find out who's publishing important work in your field. Another choice, and this might be counterintuitive sometimes, should you go with a large, a medium, or a small press? A very, very large press, of course, carries with it the weight of an enormous budget. They'll go to exhibits, they might have several tables out. You can sometimes tell by how expensive the cookies are that they're giving away, whether they give away free pens or things. But the real point is, from you as an author, now university presses, with few exceptions, as I stated earlier, do very, very careful editing. They all tap the same range of peer reviewers. If there's maybe 500 scholars out there that are constantly being asked to do peer review, it's not that if you publish with very, very large press or a very tiny one, that they're having a different level of peer review. And sometimes the smaller press, necessarily, in order to get noticed, will do a far more careful job on your book than maybe a larger press will. Also, a larger press, you may find, is coming to an exhibit or to a new meeting with as many as 300 or 400 new titles. A small press may come with only 20. They will expend more time and effort in their marketing than a larger one will. So it's a balance. On the one hand, you do want the advantage of being in a large list with a press that has international presence and that goes to quite a number of meetings. But it's not said that a smaller press might not serve your purposes just as well. So consider that. It needn't be something that necessarily precludes your choices. So having done that, we had a question earlier, and what I'll do now is I'll focus on what Michigan State does just as an example, but of course, you'll see these same sorts of breakdowns at other presses. By way of example, what do we publish in? And this was one of the questions we received online. The black areas are the ones that we currently are publishing most extensively in: African studies, agricultural studies, so forth, various kinds of histories, 19th century to current, both for US and European. Philosophy, but that's mostly in the Mimesis and Culture series, political science, sociology, or urban studies, etc. Quite a bit of history, quite a bit of environmental studies. The major series that we have are the ones that you see there on the right: African history and culture, African humanities and arts, American food and history, which is very fun. That's based on books that are stored here in the rare books collection, and so forth. You will notice that some of these things tie in very closely to activity that's actually some of the sterling characteristics of Michigan State University itself, like a diaspora series, international race and education. Others are very prestigious book series that aren't necessarily tied to areas that MSU is famous for. For instance, rhetoric, or the rhetorical history of the United States. In fact, I don't think there's a single board member on that series that's from MSU itself, but very prestigious and very well known. We also have some imprints. Most presses do. What the imprints are is that is the gray area between a hardcore scholarly book and a general interest book that happens to tap areas that our publishing program is interested in. So for instance, the Makwa and Ewid is about Native American policy studies, literature, that aren't necessarily scholarly work. Some of them might even be written by memorialists and journalists. Greenstone books will be the general interest books in history and environmental studies written for a large educated audience. And then we have a series in poetry. Now, every press that you go look at will have similar types of lists that will let you know what they're working in there. To give you an idea of the weight of those same areas that we just talked about, books that we've published in the last 4 years, the size of the type indicates how many books or of what importance in those areas we've done. So not every press will have a breakdown like that, but quite a few of them you can see by the activity in their list. And this, again, is for you to focus where should you expend your efforts to send your project. Here, in our case, these are the series that are edited by MSU faculty. But again, a typical misconception with university press publishing is that university presses exist mainly to publish their own faculty. It's not the case. In our case, MSU-based authors or editors of our publications or in our series account for about 30% of the books that we publish. There are some university presses that it's even much, much less than that. So how to submit and to whom? Again, I'll use the example of Michigan State, but the process will be exactly the same at any other website you go to. So here's our home page. And just to make things difficult, our submissions is way down at the bottom and in very small type. Because, of course, most of what our homepage or anyone's website is, it's about telling people about the books, the series we have, the journals that we publish, et cetera, what's new, et cetera. So scroll to the bottom of that page and you'll find submissions. Every press has something like that, or it'll have where to send the manuscript or how to send us a book, whatever term. We use the term submissions, that's where you should look. And then what you'll find is, clicking that, you'll find the various acquiring editors, and right now the areas in which they're acquiring. Now, you may find some crossover. Sometimes I will get, people will write both to Julie Lohr and to me because, for instance, they might have something that has to do with Great Lakes studies and Michigan history, but also touches on architectural history, so they might send the project to both of us. That's fine. And you may find the same at other presses. Some presses have a very large number of acquisitions editors, some have very few, but usually the website will tell you what areas they acquire in. So, scrolling down here, very, very important point. What do we not accept? That's very important, so that you don't waste your own time. In our case, for instance, you'll notice up under here, under what we do not accept, we've got, in our case, unsolicited works of fiction, memoir, or poetry. You won't find that at Ohio University Press, for instance, which has a specific imprint just for fiction and poetry. So, you need to look at which press it is. We don't accept simultaneous manuscript submissions, and I'll talk more about that later. Most presses do not. We don't do Festschrifts or commemorative publications, conference papers, or, as we mentioned before, unrevised dissertations. Now, I mentioned we don't accept simultaneous submissions. That's not the case with everyone. Here, for instance, is Colorado University Press, and Colorado specifically says we do accept simultaneous submissions. In other words, you have perhaps a cutting edge, perhaps something that straddles more than one field, perhaps you're not entirely sure if it would be seen as a scholarly work or general interest work, and what you want to do is test the waters and send it to several presses at the same time. Well, find those presses that say they do, but be clear and be upfront. When you write them, tell them, as we noticed before, the things not to do, tell the publisher that you have sent it to other people at the same time. Now, what usually happens is the publisher will write you back, the first one that says, I'm really interested, can I have exclusive time to peer review this, because the peer review process is not only lengthy and time consuming for the press, it's also expensive. So then you can say, right, okay, then I'll give you first choice, and you'll tell the other presses it's being considered by another press. Just as long as you're upfront, everything is fine. So, get back to us. Now you're going to send a submission to any press. This is in our case. The acquisitions questionnaire, super important. Here you would click here to find that on our website. And the acquisitions questionnaire, just an example, gives you a breakdown that helps you focus your thoughts on how to pitch your book to us. Now, what do you do when you submit your proposal for a manuscript? Don't send an entire manuscript to a publisher. especially not if you haven't spoken with them yet. Don't send them a blind submission, just a cold call. Make a compelling case. Think of this as carefully as you would when you're preparing a 100 or 150 word abstract of a journal article, something like that. Tell us how your work is different from other work in the field. Tell us also how it's complementary to other work in the field. And if possible, always send us a bibliography. In fact, I think for point of reference, I've made a handout of this one as well, too, so you can see the kinds of questions that most presses will ask these same kinds of questions, but the biggest point is to help you focus on how you want to present your case. Now, what you might do, if your manuscript is already ready or close to being final, then what you can do is send a 1, 2, maximum 3-page explanation of what you're doing. Sometimes you will need it to be longer if it's a particularly innovative work. Also, if you're proposing an edited volume with multiple contributors, you're going to want to send a list of who those contributors are or who you plan to include. So again, give us this overview, compact in a few words, of what you think it's going to do. If the manuscript's already ready, send us your preliminary table of contents. And if you can, always include the bibliography. Then you might also include, if the editor says please send it, a sample chapter. It also would help a great deal if you give the editor the estimated length. You can express this in words, or you can express it in how long your typescript is. Let the editor know if you foresee artwork, images, maps, how many, and if any of that's going to be in color. And pursuant to that, especially if you need color images, if you have foreseen any outside funding from your department or from grants. You should also let the publisher know right away. This doesn't preclude, this doesn't make an exception of your book, but it's just good for the publisher to know whether you have published any parts of the manuscript already. In most cases, you will have. In conference proceedings, not conference proceeding, I'm sorry, in collected works, one of the essayists may already have done so, but they may have done so in some place that's hard to get to, so that's not going to preclude publication. You may have tested the waters by one of your chapters or two of them may have been published as a journal article, et cetera. Just let us know that, and that way the whole process will be very upfront. Also let us know if, yes, you've published one of the chapters, but that was 10 years ago, and since you've updated it, and so this does not at all preclude the fact of doing the book. Also, in all cases, do not be discouraged. You will find when you get rejected, and you will get rejected, it's an awful word, you will be declined. Within some publishers, if you want to know the shop talk, it will be killed. 95% of the time, it has absolutely nothing to do with the quality or the content. It has to do with how an editor is shaping their list. What other projects that you may not even be aware are very, very similar. They might have done 3 things in women's studies very, very recently. You got a 4th project, and you're thinking in the next 2 years, I don't want to do 4 very similar works. They might have certain kinds of targets they want to aim for, or maybe they're just shifting on where they're going. Most usually, your rejection will be of the nature, it doesn't fit with us right now, and if they're a good acquisitions editor and have been doing their job for many, many years, they will also send you a list of other presses that they know are looking for just that sort of thing. The wonderful thing about university presses is this is wonderfully collegial. One thing that happened to me at Washington at the American Association, Anthropological Association, a fellow came up to me and he had a manual about how to write anthropological work. And he said, would you possibly be interested? I said, come with me. I walked right around the corner, and there was the University of Chicago Press that does exactly that sort of thing. A half hour later, he came back beaming, they accepted the book. So we're very good about that. If we can think of another publisher, because our role, we're non-for-profit, but above all, what we're in this business to do is to disseminate knowledge and to help you get your book out there. So be patient. It takes time, and also don't read a rejection as being the work doesn't work. How long is this going to take? I love this picture. I won't say where I took it. It's one of the largest university presses in America. The editor is a dear, dear friend who is considered, by the way, one of the finest editors in his field. I waited till he went to lunch and took a photograph of his desk. That's what you're fighting, and he knows that. This is what you're fighting with. This person, trust me, really reads all that. The timelines, on average, even a small university press, this is an average, for every book they accept, will read 5 manuscripts. So if a very busy acquisitions editor, and you're usually asked to publish between 20 and 25 books a year, that means you have evaluated between 100 and 125. And you've probably received maybe 60 to 70 more proposals than that, but you've only spent a little bit of time with them because you see that they're not a fit for your press. But you will have read a substantial amount. So that's what our desks look like, so have pity. So let's say success. The editors looked at it, they said, this is great. I'd like to follow it up. Let's see if it works. So what happens next? The editor's shown initial interest. He's going to invite you, she's going to invite you, to send in your completed or mostly completed manuscript. Now, by mostly completed, it could well be that you have a work that you want to get some kind of a commitment on first before you go headlong and spend your entire sabbatical finishing it before even contacting anyone. Your work may be mapped out in its entirety, but it may actually be written 3 out of 10 chapters or presentable or something like that. Maybe more would be better. So you don't necessarily have to have a completely finished manuscript. You might have, but something substantial that can be sent out for peer review. We sometimes do 2-tier peer review. In other words, a book that is planned to be a 200-page book, I've got the equivalent of 60, 80 pages worth of typescript, but all ready to test the waters and see how it's going and get some feedback, I may send that out for peer review in a preliminary way. Get some excellent peer response back to the author can work on that, and then we move forward from there. There will be, after peer review, possible, indeed I would say probable revisions. It's pretty rare that revisions aren't suggested. And ultimately then we'll need to have editorial board approval, or not. Sometimes a book can go through all the phases and the editorial board will debate it. Depends on the nature of the book, sometimes how the peer reviews were done. If they're not overwhelmingly 100% enthusiastic, but they raise some issues, the board may table a project and send it back for further review, or the board may actually have the last word and say, but that's pretty rare. I've been doing this for 38 years now. I've seen this happen maybe 5 times, where a board will say, I understand your enthusiasm, Mr. Acquisitions Editor. I understand how closely you've worked with the author, but we don't think this fits with our press. Again, that's not necessarily a quality judgment. They're just saying, we don't see where XYZ University ought to be sponsoring this book. It's very, very rare. Okay, all good. Let's say it's gone forward very well. What's next? Contract and your production timeline. Let's talk a little bit about peer review first. Again, let's go back to our AUP site. The resources for scholarly publishers this time, not for authors. And there you will find under, again, resources, scholarly publishers, what you want to look at best practices for peer review. Now, I didn't print one of these out. It's a very large document. You can read it online. The cover looks like this once you've clicked that PDF. And it's a very informative document for you as an author because it shows you what the criteria are that university presses use. If you download that, I think it's about a 30-page document. It's not so bad. You can even just read it live online. It makes for very interesting reading, even from your point of view of how you are presenting your book to others. And so, again, you'll access that through the AAU site. Go to resources for scholarly publishers this time, not for authors. You'll hit peer review, and the PDF is there. If any of you have difficulty accessing that, let me know. I've got the PDF on my machine. Just send me an email, and I'll be happy to send it to you. So here's the thing, from your point of view. What sorts of issues do peer reviewers consider? Now, again, I printed out the questionnaire that we use, and you may find this quite useful to you. Again, because you'll see from the point of view, you'll enter into the mindset and the head of the referees who are your own colleagues. I've got two of them here, the one for scholarly works and the one for creative works, so pass them around as a benchmark. But basically, here's a summary of the kinds of questions that we ask reviewers. And of course, we also ask them, expand on this and address any other issues you can think of. How and why does this manuscript make a significant scholarly contribution? Is the argument lucid? Can it be understood by an interested lay reader as well as those in the field, or is it just for those with knowledge in the field? What can be done to improve it? Please be specific. Sometimes we get really long peer reviews, and we'll get back a heavily annotated manuscript where somebody has maniacally gone through and practically pre-edited the work showing every little bit, which is great. Does the descriptive language need to be altered? And then, of course, a couple of key questions. Do you know any comparable works currently available? You'll find that most presses have the same kind of list of questions. Would you use this work in class? Of course, adoption is always a great thing to know whether or not we can count on it. Would others? In what classes would you use it? Of course, we have to ask this question. To your knowledge, is any part of this in danger of being considered plagiarized? And then the three critical questions. Do you recommend that this be published as is, published with revisions, not published? As a benchmark, I would say that 80% of the time we get published with revisions, and sometimes it's pretty minor revisions. Another 12% of the time, let's say, 18% of the time, we'll get published as is. It's great. And very rarely, 1 or 2%, will get not published. Now that not published might mean not published with your university press. Not that it's bad. And then any other comments. This one is the one for creative works, because of course we do creative nonfiction sometimes. Sometimes someone may even write a historical memoir that's based on, right now, for instance, we're considering a memoir based on a biography written by a teacher in Western Michigan in the 19th century. So a substantial part of the book is not rewritten at all, it's commented on. So these kinds of questions are quite interesting because for creative writing, that's important. What makes it unique, again, is it thematically or otherwise an entity on itself? Is the writing lucid? Who's the audience? Would you use it in class? What could be done to improve the manuscript? And sometimes we get essays about that. Please be specific as to organization, voice, subject matter, narrative flow, and you as the author will really appreciate it. You will really be stunned by the generosity of your peers and colleagues. You've probably done these reviews yourself for other publishers, so you know. The generosity, I can't remember ever really reading a mean-spirited review. The generosity with which suggestions are made to help you organize, again, we're all in the same mission, disseminate knowledge and get it out there. So that can be a very, very, very useful process. The feedback that you get from the reviewers is wonderful for the author who's been sitting alone in your garret or your office late into the night typing and not getting feedback. Again, is there a different way to order the material to present more aesthetically? Are there similar books in the field? And of course, there will also be the same three questions at the end of that one. How you respond to peer review is very important. You don't have to accept or agree with everything that reviewers recommend. You'll find that most of the comments and advice that the reviewers offer, especially having to do with organization, documentation, or structure, will be very useful to you. But you can certainly disagree with some of the suggestions. I mean, it may have ended up on the desk of another scholar who severely disagrees with your method. And of course, these are all anonymous. We do double-blind review. The reviewer doesn't know who you are, you don't know who the reviewer is, so they're very frank. But they're always written with the idea that they're not mean-spirited. It's not simply to shoot something down, is to try and build on something, but they can be very critical. But you can disagree with it, you, the author, especially if you think the reviewer hasn't completely understood or appreciated your approach. If that's the case, then you make your case, you defend your position, you defend your approach, you may accept 50% of the comments, refuse others, and just make a compelling case writing to the acquisitions editor and thinking that you're also speaking to the faculty board as to why you want to stand your ground. That's fine. All of this is a scholarly process. Oh dear, I just lost my stuff. There you So that's very important. I mean, that the way that you respond to these, it is a dialogue after all. So, to be done well, necessarily, now I mentioned earlier that commercial publishers are more rapid, trade publishers are the fastest of all, but they don't do such thorough work. It will be a long process. We do at least 2 sequential reviews. Sometimes for creative work, we'll do them simultaneously, but you've got to give the reviewer time. They may ask between 4 and 6 weeks, and it takes time to find a reviewer. Right now, for instance, I'm having the devil's own time because everyone has exams coming up or end of, and so people are telling me, send me the manuscript in June, which means the clock starts in June. And I have to tell the author, you know, be patient. Then there will be author revisions. Of course there will be, almost always. And if they are substantial, if the author agrees and says, you're right, thanks for the advice, I'm going to start over, there will be another review at the end of that. Then the press's editorial board meets to give, hopefully, final approval. The whole process will take, at best, several weeks, but much more likely several months, just so you know. All right, let's say we've gone forward. The editorial board is on board. They're thrilled. Everything is good. Some contract basics. And this is important to know, I think. Shouldn't lose sight of what goes on with contracts and what you should think of. The first one is, in whose name is it? You'll notice that some presses do all of their books in the name of the press. Some presses, like ours, will copyright a book in the name of Michigan State University trustees, but that's only if it's an edited work and there are multiple authors present. If it's a unique work with one author, we tend to take the copyright out the way that trade publishers do now, in the name of the author. Nothing really changes in the way that the contract is written. What happens is, should the work ever go out of print, and with university presses this happens way down the line, a trade press may put your book out of print after 2 years, or they'll sell it to another imprint. If you haven't sold a magnificent number of copies inside of a very short timeline, you won't even find your book anywhere except on Amazon. You won't find it in bookstores. A university press, no. We have books that we've had in print since 1953. And most university presses will keep their books in print for a very, very long time. That's one of the advantages. But don't worry if the copyright isn't taken out in your name in some case. The fact is, you never lose your intellectual property. That is always yours. And you never lose your moral rights. Under no circumstance, and read the contract carefully to make sure of this, under no circumstance can a publisher decide to revise your work, readapt it without your permission, or in any way retouch it without your permission. The intellectual property always remains yours. The fact of having it copyrighted in your name means that should a book revert to you to allow you to take it elsewhere, then it's already at the Copyright Office in your name and you don't have to do new paperwork. Royalties, various things to consider. Digital versus print splits. Will they be straight, just one royalty across the board? Will they be tiered? Now, a commercial publisher will give you royalties that are very, very attractive, of course. They'll be on the list price of the book, so if a book costs $20, no matter what it's sold for, you get your royalty on that $20. A university press will do it on net, in other words, what it actually collects. Now, enormous royalties like in the 10, the 15, the 20% range is something only trade publishers usually can afford to do. However, what university presses will do, they might tier them. The first 1,000 copies is one level, then from 1,001 up to 3,000 this level, and then should your book become more and more successful, it gets larger and larger. One thing that is a misconception is, since ebooks must not cost anything, you can give the author a huge royalty. Well, actually, we'll see later that that's really, unfortunately, a fallacy. But should a publisher ask you, some contracts do that, to recoup their expenses before paying you the royalties, which is a form of subvention, you may negotiate that. You may find that maybe if your book is so esoteric and is so focused that in order to get it published, you would go in that direction. Make sure that there is a very clear statement in the contract what they mean by recuperating expenses. In other words, if they say, once we have collected $1,000, or once we've sold 400 copies. Make sure there's a precise number there. Otherwise, there's this nebulous line of what were your expenses, and besides, why should you care how much it costs the publisher to publish that book? That's theirs. So if you see that in a contract, pay attention to it. Costs of artwork and index, usually in our field, in university publishing, that will be on the onus of the author, but it need not be as expensive as you think. Permissions for artwork, usually we're asking the author to track those down. In the formats, how many formats are covered? Do you want to give away hard, paperback, electronic? All those things you can think about. And subsidiary rights. Subsidiary rights are things like other languages, other territories, audiobooks, excerpts, dramatic rights. You should never take less than a 50% share in your contract. In other words, what happens is for instance, let's say I want to do a Spanish or a German edition of one of the books that you've written. I do all the negotiating, I do all the contracting, I collect that money from the foreign publisher. You, the author, should get 50% of that at least, never less than that. And this is interesting. You may want to keep some of those. You may be bilingual. You may already have a conversation with a Spanish publisher. You may work a lot in another country and you've already had contact with someone else. You may want to say, no, I'd like to retain Spanish rights. I want to negotiate on my own German rights. Or I already have a contact to write a screenplay, so I want to keep dramatic rights. Or you might want to not give the publisher the right to extrapolate excerpts from your book and use it. All of that is negotiable. Always bear in mind, even if you're a first-time author, a contract isn't a template, it's a negotiation. So look through there. What are you doing with your contract? You are assigning rights to commercial exploitation to the publisher. You're not giving up your intellectual property. You may find that lots of things the publisher does, you're perfectly happy to have them do it. Find other translations, open networks out, distribution in different territories. You don't want to futz with that. But if there are some that you want to keep, do bear in mind, it won't prejudicate what you're doing by saying, I want to keep audio rights, I want to keep translation rights. That's perfectly fine. Again, study your situation. You may find that you pursuing the idea of finding someone to write a screenplay on your great novel is far more trouble than it's worth. The publisher may do a much better job of it, whatever. But bear in mind, you don't necessarily have to do everything that's in the template. The production timeline, okay, now we've gone further. We've got a contract in hand, we've gotten it approved, you've done your revises, you're excited to find out what the schedule is going to be for editing. You as the author have to take care of artwork permissions, artwork files. I've got a handout here because someone asked online, how do you go about that? So this is the penultimate handout, by the way. I'm not sending you home with too much paper. This is just so you get an idea. Usually the publisher will give you a template both for asking for permission to use artwork and how to go about it. We usually ask the author to write it because some archives and some art resource companies can charge an awful lot of money if the publisher writes, because they figure the publisher somehow is going to make a killing, and so they'll charge you as much money as they can. When the author says, look, I'm writing a scholarly book, I think I'll sell, if I'm lucky, 1,500 copies. The book is only going to cost $29.95. Cut me a break. Now, of course, you as the author, I always like to say, the golden rule of when you're producing, let's say a movie or something like that, there's three things to bear in mind. Never use your own money, never use your own money, and never use your own money. Find a foundation, get a grant, talk to your department, try not to pull out of your own pocket. Second thing to think about artwork, many authors tend to walk into this somewhat naively. A great deal of artwork is public domain. A great deal of illustrations are public domain. Speak with your acquisitions editor who will have you talk with their rights person. There's also the simple factor, in some cases, of fair use. You may use a part of a map that might be in a copyrighted book, but you using that part of it doesn't infringe on anyone's rights. So before you go asking permissions and before you go paying for them, find out first, have a conversation with your editor and with the rights person. Do you really need to ask for that permission? The converse is also true. You may find a medieval portrait somewhere online and say, that's great, I'll use it. Funny enough, some countries have a perpetual copyright. For instance, England has a perpetual copyright. The Queen owns the copyright even in manuscripts. So you have to make sure, if you've gotten that image photographed from an archive done by their photo reproduction service, it's not said that it's public domain. So that's something you need to deal with carefully. And finally, contributor contracts. If you're doing an edited volume, or maybe you have commissioned a friend to write a preface and you want to have a contract in place, it's up to you, the author, to obtain those, but you will receive a template from the publisher to how to do that. The publisher will be giving you an editing timeline and work it out with your own schedule, because they'll say, in 8 weeks you'll get edited copy, and you say, oh goodness, in 8 weeks I'll be traveling. And so you have to work it out, because usually they give you a short turnaround time. So you need to work that out with a publisher. Production phases can be completely out of your control. It may have to do with where they print, because sometimes you think, why is it taking 12 to 18 months to print my book? Some books can be ready in 9 months. Some books take a full 15 months to produce, but there's two considerations being borne in mind. The production phases are, if your book is heavily illustrated or complicated, we may send it to China to print, sorry to say. Well, we'll see how the trade war goes, but maybe we'll be sending them to Brazil. And so sometimes we have to add an extra 11 to 15 weeks just to have these things produced. And there's a marketing release strategy. We don't want to have bunches of books come out all at one time. The marketing department may say, a book may even be ready. I may even have copies in the warehouse. You may have received advance copies, and I may have sent out copies to be reviewed, but we won't release the book for 3 months because the timeline would be perfect for a certain meeting, for a certain event, because you can do a book signing, so we may not want to pre-release the book. That's why you'll find that most of your contracts will say, we will do it in a timely fashion between 12 and 18 months. Wait a minute. Now, again, that can be discussed. If you have a reason why you think your book is almost ready to go, there's no illustrations, it's not complicated, you might have a conversation with your publisher, and you may find that you can do it more quickly, but usually that's the timeline. Now, just by way of, I mentioned ebooks earlier. Are ebooks overtaking print? As it turns out, not really. We all thought they would. In fact, if you read that article that goofy photograph of me came from back in 2009, I was predicting much nicer figures. Didn't turn out that way. Our print versus electronic revenue 10 years ago was about 14% of our revenue came from electronic. And you'll find that this is almost exactly the same with nearly every academic publisher. 10 years later, it had only grown to 37%. And in there is my journals program that almost exclusively earns money only from electronic. On average, a serious textbook publisher, a trade scholarly publisher, and a commercial publisher, you will find that we hit a peak of somewhere between 20 and 25% of adoption of electronic books. It's come back to about 10 to 12%. Now, even the books that are in the aggregators and libraries that are almost exclusively electronic, they're not being accessed like complete books. They're being read piecemeal, like single chapters or single pages. So that doesn't really help in the mix. So when you see in your contract about, and you're evaluating electronic print, it hasn't become the big cash cow you would think it is. Where the big change in electronic has happened is, of course, in magazines and in leisure literature, beach reads, things of that sort, stuff you read on an airplane. Of course, that's taken over print in a very big way. A little something about costs. I think this is important to realize because, again, when negotiating or when talking with a publisher, especially with a university press, which is not-for-profit, has very tight budgets, sometimes they're quite eye-opening. Here's some typical profit and loss statements that we have from recent books. And the eye-opener here that I want you to look at is this entire section that I've isolated is simply the actual physical cost of preparing books. You'll notice that all the prep costs, all the costs that I would sustain before I ever went to print the book, so if it was just an ebook, I've spent $10,000 there, and there's only another $4,000 to print 1,000 copies of the book. So an enormous amount of the work, and that doesn't even include, in some cases, the time of the employees that have been working with you, that have been working to get that book going. So it's a really interesting mix. Here in this case, again, the total cost of goods sold is $14,000. but almost $10,000 of that was expended before the book ever hit one format or the other, whether it was hardbound or paperbound or electronic. And here again, these are books that are done print on demand, the famous books where we don't have warehousing costs because we just do in small batches. Here again, look at the incidence. $7,000 of it is just preparing the book, and an extra $3,700 is in preparing maybe 250 copies of it. So, and these costs don't include marketing, logistics, warehousing, and overhead. This is just to give you an idea of when negotiating for royalties as well. There's a lot of urban legends about how little it costs to prepare a book, but I gave you a Word document, it's ready to go, all you did was pour it into a container. Not quite. Actually, right now, the true cost of publishing a scholarly monograph, a study was done with the Mellon Foundation 2 years ago, and it showed that the true cost, when everything is considered, ranges from $15,000 to $55,000 per book to create a book. So a sobering thought, but an important one, I think, to keep in mind. Also, another thing to bear in mind when you look at your royalties is you see a book that costs $30. The publisher never sees that amount of money. The publisher has to give out discounts that go anywhere from 45 to 65%, and even worse if we're selling through Amazon. So the actual cost of these sorts of things, but that also explains to you why the commercial publishers price their books so high. They know that they have maybe 200 libraries that have to buy that volume, and they'll pay anything they can to get it. But that isn't disseminating your work very far and wide. So as an author, that might not be a very satisfying solution. Some stark realities that are also recent. This figure is the percentage of library expenditures as a total of university expenditures at an average of 40 major US institutions reporting since 1982. When I started in university publishing in 1986, I was listening to editors quite older than I was, and just for the record, when I first arrived at the University of Chicago Press, I remember the Chronicle of Higher Education had a lead article in 1986 that said, "Is university publishing in crisis?" So it's been 40 years. So yes, it's always been. What's the point? I remember someone from Oxford University Press telling me that in his field, it was absolutely normal to do a first print run of 5,000 copies if they were doing a historical overview of a particularly popular period in European history or a biography of a major military figure. Today, average print runs are about 1,000, 1,200 for books that we think will do very well, and some books expanded their entire natural life selling 500 to 600 copies. That shows you, just as a budget of acquisition, where we're going. And that brings back, of course, the reality of the pressure that publishers are under to make very careful selections. Now that's for scholarly books, and some of the other questions that I'd received online also had to do with books that clearly are aimed toward a much broader market. Where do you go look? Here's where you go look. Now, do not buy this book because it retails for $399. Every library has one. Every library. You could buy this one. That one's $29. They're renewed every year. Last year's volume is worthless. Now, the one for literary agents is if you feel you have a novel in you, or you feel that your memoir will speak to a very, very broad audience, then, as I said earlier, trade publishers probably will ignore any submission that doesn't come through a literary agent. Literary agents will take quite a lot from your cut. They will insist that they want usually 15%. The point is, they won't take you on if they don't think that your project or what you're proposing isn't going to be very successful, because that's their entire business model is based on. However, a good literary agent can work wonders if you're working in fiction, if you're working in very, very general audience, popularizing science, things of this sort, you want to go with trade publishers. These are two very good resources to bear in mind and to think about. And you will also find online a lot of evaluations on how effective some of these are and not. The LMP is bigger than the Manhattan phone book. That's why it costs so much money. Tons of information in there, tons of places to go. Another place to go, if you're thinking about creative writing, or you might even be a chemist, or you might be a sociologist, but you have been secretly writing a detective novel, or maybe you do some poetry in free time. The place to go, rather than going to your own society meetings, is AWP. This is the Association of Writers and Writing Programs. It's a huge meeting. They do have a lot of publishers that go there as well. What you especially will find, it's usually expensive to go to because they're expensive cities. I think it's in Seattle next year. It's a huge meeting. You'll find everything under the sun, all sorts of wacky stuff. But what you'll find is colleagues, roundtables, seminars that talk about getting published. A lot of people that are first-time publishing in a field, they might have had a number of books published, but they're getting into a new area. They're doing something provocative. They're doing something cutting edge. You want to find an indie publisher, that's the place to go, and that's a good place to start. AWP meeting. It's not for publishers, really, although publishers exhibit. It's for writers meeting other writers and meeting people that are in the writing business. Another thing to consider, and this is really, really interesting, I think. This is recent. I must say that in some ways it's been a very well-kept secret, because I found the MSU website because a colleague of mine at the University of Michigan sent me the link to our own website. I thought that was grand. This is an initiative that was begun with some significant funding. Spectacularly, Michigan State is one of the, I think, 13 institutions that has underwritten this. In our case, the representative for this was Dean Chris Long. And there are 61 university presses that are on board. How it works, and you'll see, is that the universities have set aside $15,000 in funding to fund 3 90,000-word monographs each year for 5 years. It's a significant amount of money. The money comes from the provost. It doesn't need to be published with us. You as an MSU faculty member, an MSU scholar, can publish with any one of those 61 other publishers if, in fact, the area you're publishing in, as we said before, might not be something I publish in, just as I may publish something from another institution. What happens is the provost's money from the home institution of the faculty member puts up that money. I don't know how many people have applied for this so far, but I know that the first year of funding is the current academic year, so it runs out at the end of 2018 in the summer. And I don't know if any of these have been granted yet or not. Have a look. It's a very, very interesting proposal. And you might find, now, certain things are excluded from them. The final work will be open access. What is excluded are the monographs have to be authored or co-authored by a member of MSU faculty. And again, you can publish it with any one, if you go on the website, any one of the 61 presses that are on board. Critical editions, edited collections, creative works, textbooks, and translations are not eligible, but that leaves an immense range of things that can still be published, and they will especially be interested in, because this will live digitally, it'll be online, there'll be open access, so your contract will be one of your ownership, but it won't be one of making money from. But what is especially interesting to them is if they have digital enhancement. Now, the digital enhancement doesn't necessarily mean bells and whistles of a certain kind, but you all know that some of the books that you have in mind, you might have hundreds of images that you would love to fit in the book, but it isn't physically possible to do in a regular book. Well, that's what digital is for. You can have a live link to all kinds of resources, audio, blogs, you might have music examples, you might have videos. An enriched volume like that can be a very, very creative thing. This is a very exciting opportunity, I think, and I think you should consider it. Go look at the website, go have a look. It's ungodly long to read, but the shorthand is, as usual, I think they start out with a fun-sounding acronym and then work backward to get names. So it's called TOME, which is Toward an Open Monograph Ecosystem. But this award is really significant because $15,000 to underwrite a 90,000 word monograph, and there is no preclusion of you needing to be a multiply published author. This can even be perfect for a first-time project, or especially if it's a first-time project with digital enhancement, which I haven't thought about yet. Another area not to be overlooked is our very own Espresso book machine here, which is part of a very, very large network. This is only one page. Of course, Michigan State has one. The wonderful thing about this is, once you prepared your book, again, this is going to be for something where you have something particularly arcane. Maybe you have exhumed fascinating work that you're going to comment on, add an introduction, but maybe it's a piece that's a unique piece that's only in our rare books collection, and you think it deserves to be out there in the larger world, or it could be your memoirs, it could be an initial novel, whatever you want to be. And the great thing is it doesn't only exist at your university, it goes into a network of machines. In fact, if you get onto the ondemandbooks.com site, you'll see a geographic location of where all these machines are available throughout the world. And once your digital document is in that system, anywhere, anyone can order that book through that. Some of these books actually are also offered for sale through some online vendors. They charge an extra amount. They obtain them from whatever local institution. It's not only libraries. For instance, out in Grand Rapids, Schuler Books has one. So it's a very good way for a first-time author who just wants to test the waters and get their work out there to get it started. Here's another bit of advice. The simple fact that you have self-published a book to test the waters and see how it all works doesn't preclude that you in the future might not then retire that, make it no longer available, maybe revamp it a bit, and then take it to a regular publisher to have it published as a non-self-published book. It's a good way to get a start there as well. So all I can close with, and I've got some questions that I'll be looking at here and then take questions from you as well. Good luck. Now, I had received a few questions. I'll address some of them. I think I've covered most of them, of the ones that were sent to us ahead of time. One person asks, if I have a contact with an academic press, what are some of the marketing strategies I should consider using? You actually don't need to think about that. We send out, and most presses do, a very complicated marketing questionnaire after that initial author questionnaire that you saw, that you send along with your proposal to give us a preliminary idea. And once the project gets rolling, anyone's marketing department will contact you and they'll ask you to provide 25 to 50 keywords that can be used in search engines. They'll be asking about your availability for events and appearances, for book signings, for lectures, conferences you might attend, roundtables we might organize for you, where to send review copies. You'll find that university presses are very, very generous with, if you send a very specific list, even if you've got 50 or 60 places you think have a good possibility of reviewing your book, a university press will keep after that. Mailings, organizations and societies, digital media, whether you're available to prepare things, do blogs, Facebook, Twitter, websites, prepare on YouTube. So the marketing, you don't need to come up with that on your own. The marketing department will send out all sorts of proposals, prompts for you to follow up on that. Another person has mentioned that they're writing an autobiography. Autobiographies, if your name recognition isn't huge, it's extremely difficult that a university press or commercial publisher will take them on, unless you've done something very scandalous very recently and your name is in the news. As you know, some of the most interesting people in the world, their biographies don't sell. Some of the most uninteresting people in the world who happen to get into the news, their biographies might sell. The best way that I would think about approaching that is the one that I just mentioned. Either you might go, you don't need to attend AWP if that's expensive, but start looking at indie publishers. They're very keen on things like that, especially. Usually a university press will publish biographies of no longer living people. Therefore, they're critical studies of a biography of. If you're still alive, and God willing you should be, you might also think about self-publishing first. As I said, there are also solutions of self-publishing. That doesn't mean your book will never go anywhere after that. You test the waters first, get some feedback, and you can always then address another publisher after that. Another question that we got is, how do we seek permission to reproduce an image from a website? Well, first of all, images on websites look fantastic on your computer. They print lousy. The digital weight, their resolution is just awful. They don't print well at all. So simply capturing, had a lot of authors that captured a number of lovely looking images from a website. By the time you take them to print them, they're about that large. Necessarily so. They have to be that light to exist on a website. Also, be very, very careful with websites. Lots and lots and lots of images that are on websites may even claim they have permission. They really don't. And it's going down a real rabbit hole to try and find out who owns it. And you usually find it out when you get a letter from a lawyer that gives you a cease and desist and says to destroy all your copies of your book. So again, work carefully with your publishers first. You might propose some illustrations, but the publishers will let you know if it's safe to go there or not. Another person says, how do you seek permission to reproduce work of an author who is no more and the copyright was owned by him? Well, but that doesn't mean the copyright's gone, as you know, from the Google Books litigation in recent years, these orphaned works. The fact is you still have to make a good faith effort to track them down. A good way to do it is to look at who the last publisher was. Well, sometimes the last publisher has gone belly up as well. You don't know who owns them. But there will be heirs, trust me. I used to work in the music reference book business, and we used just a few bars or a few swatches of music, and they wait until you've published it, and then you get a letter from the heirs, who may be grandchildren and have never even met the person who wrote it, but they want the money. So you need to be very careful. You will notice that in some cases books will carry a disclaimer in the front of it where it says, every effort was expended to try to find the owners of the copyright of this image. If you or they, please come forward. And you'll find that on your side, if it's a scholarly book, fair use is a very broad concept. And if you're talking about something, the simple fact that you've needed to use an image, you'll want to stay away from certain things. Stay away from Disney, stay away from Warner Brothers. But other things, if it's within the context and it's a small image of you writing critically about something, that's absolutely fair use. And you'll get good information from your publisher about that. Another person asked about doing books that are primarily pictorial content. Well, that's very problematic. The first problem with that is people really don't buy lovely coffee table books anymore, sad to say, even because the images that you can get on a computer screen are often more accurate or more brilliant, especially if you have a latest generation Macintosh. They're often, the colors are even more precise than you can get, except with the most expensive printing. But if you're doing maybe a regional study, look into creative grant outlets. For instance, you won't find many grants available in the humanities simply for publishing a book, but if you turn it around, there's a lot of grant availability for doing things like exhibitions or doing things like traveling shows, out of which then at the end of that you can have what the people in the STEM area call a deliverable. We also want to print a catalog to accompany the show. Sometimes you'll get enough funding to offset the cost of being able to include color images in a book. So you need to get creative there with your funding. A university press by themselves usually can't afford that. When you see presses, and there are some university presses, that publish a whole range of beautiful art catalogs, usually what's happened, that's been completely paid for by the museum that commissioned the art catalog. So it's not that, you know, these $50,000, $60,000, $90,000 production costs can be absorbed like that. Someone else says, what services are available at MSU to assist in publishing? I just mentioned the espresso machine. There are a number of really fabulous online publishing services. You're probably familiar with Amazon's Create Space. There are companies that often are regular printers, but they also have a self-publishing module that can produce very, very top-end products for you. If you'd like to even just publish a few books to hand out in class or whatever, you might look into Bookmobile of Minnesota, et cetera. If you send me an email, if you're particularly interested in that, I could send you a list of reputable suppliers that do very good work in that area. Someone asked an interesting question, and they said they are writing about a historical figure. They themselves are a scholar, but they're targeting the book to middle-level readers, and in fact, they're trying to interest history for younger readers. Again, there are university presses that publish in that area. And you will find, usually it's critique of younger literature, but there are people that are specifically targeting younger literature. We ourselves print a series of books that's been quite successful over time called Discovering the Peoples of Michigan. Each one is commissioned on a different ethnicity. Michigan, it turns out, after California, is the state with the broadest range of different ethnicities that have kept their ethnic profile. And so this is an ongoing series, but they're agile little booklets, and they're written for an intelligent general reader. You don't need any kind of specialization. They're quite fun. And they provide a service that the kinds of service that a university press does, because in doing regional publishing, we touch with areas that a large commercial publisher can't really afford, it's not profitable enough. But even if it's not necessarily an academic book, you're doing a service to your community by publishing these kinds of ethnic histories. If anyone else has any questions here, I've exhausted the questions that we got online. Yeah.
The espresso machine, I heard that might be not new here at MSU.
Hi, I'm with the espresso machine.
Yes.
Our contract with Xerox is ending at the end of June. That means Xerox no longer wants to maintain it because they only have a couple of them in the country still. So what we're doing at the library, we put in a funding request for additional machinery to offer that service. But it will no longer be the espresso machine after, well, whenever we get the new equipment. But we will continue to offer printing, binding, trimming, book publishing services, and then on-demand catalog that you mentioned. You can do that on your own from any computer. You don't need to come into the espresso machine to self-publish, to on-demand those kind of
Right. And the kind of print files that you prepare for an espresso machine, which are a kind of print-ready PDF, are usable on any one of the machines in that network. And so even if it isn't printed right here in East Lansing, like I said, for instance, a client here in Michigan would get a copy sent to them from Grand Rapids. So the network itself is still in place. Just have a look at their website.
You mentioned with some qualifications that a small press may give more care to a book if they're interested. How do you define the MSU Press in terms of small, medium, or large press?
We're medium-ish. I would define a small press a press that publishes between, let's say, 15 or fewer books a year and hasn't got a journals program. They group the tiers of presses within the association by the amount of money they earn per year. So there's a group 1, 2, 3, and 4. But that can be a deceptive number, because some presses that have been around a long time, Cambridge, I believe, has been around for 400 years. I have a very large backlist. And so much of their money is coming from a backlist. I would define a medium-sized press, therefore a press that publishes between 30 and 55, 60 books a year. We do 42 books this year. We're growing right now. We're going to be targeting 55 to 60, and we have 10 journals. Large presses, you start getting into the range of they're doing 100 or more books a year. Oxford, I believe, does 1,000 books a year. They are an industry unto themselves. It's not said, because many of these presses have enormous staffs, it's not said at all that they'll spend less care with your book, but there are so many things going on at any one time that you might find that just for reasons of the amount of time someone can spend with you, you might find that your experience with a smaller press can be enormously more satisfying, especially if you're a first-time author. Now, I'm not going to say that's absolutely the case. I mean, many years ago, I worked at America's largest university press, and I think we spent a great deal of care with our authors. But I'm just saying, don't necessarily exclude a small press. And some of the small presses do fantastic work in areas that the larger or medium presses don't even go near. For instance, if someone were to talk about creative nonfiction, we do a few books in that area. We have a journal, but I would immediately recommend Iowa. There are some presses that do fabulous work with business and economics. They only do about 10 titles a year, but that's their focus, et cetera, and so forth. So I think my argument was, don't necessarily go after a press just because they have a massive catalog. It's not that you'll be ignored, you might be, You certainly would be at a trade press if you don't sell a lot of copies right away. But don't write off a small press just because they're small. Sometimes they're small because it works well for their budgets and it works well for their institution, but they do outstanding work. For the most part, I would have no problem saying that almost all of the presses within the community of the AUP, those 140 presses, all strive to do outstanding work. You could hold the book of one press next to another one. I think our designs are better than most. And we do very careful copy editing. But I think, you compare something from Monster Press and something from Tiny Press, and you'll find that the quality seems to be exactly the same. So it's a matter of finding which one is a right fit for you. Yeah.
Can you advise us a little bit on trade publishers? And I have two in mind. And I'm talking about those who actually reach out to new authors. And in particular, there is Page Publishing and there is Transatlantic. So what is the catch? I mean, I looked them up, and there's a lot of, a lot of hidden things and a lot of problems, and they charge you stuff and so on.
If they charge you, be aware. It's not said they won't print your book and publish it, but again, except for something like the artwork that I mentioned, that we do ask the authors to track that down, I don't see where an author should be paying for the publication. Especially for a first-time author, if they really, really want your book, there's no reason why they should say, oh, this is great, we love it, it's fantastic. Now, just send us $40,000. No. But that's not even necessarily vanity publishing. There are some academic publishers in Europe that their publishing model is, I could call it the print version of open access. They really have no illusion they're ever going to print their books. Many of you here are probably close to my age, and you've probably gone to European conferences where they give you lovely books for free. They're part of your package, and they might have been printed by the local historical society, the local university, or something like that. And they might even have a price written on them. But what's happened is, I'm thinking of a particular Italian publisher that does excellent work. But what they do is, there might be a committee that's put together conference proceedings, very important work, and they do their accounting. It'll cost us $20,000 to do it. It'll cost us $10,000 to market it, and they will market it. And since I won't sell any copies, I'm losing $10,000 profit. So you give me $40,000 and I'll do the book for you. And they do a lovely job, and basically then they give all the books away. But you as an author, if you had a foundation grant, that's one thing, because then the book gets published, it gets out there, every academic library will have a copy. But you as a first-time writer, no, I would avoid that. They reach out to you because they're not duping you. I mean, there are some people that would. Those are the vanity publishers, and of course you stay away from those. But basically, you really shouldn't be the one that's putting out that money. If there's something special, for instance, if you came to me and you said, I've got this study, but I need to have 60 color photographs, and I tell you, well, I can afford to do the book, but I can't afford the 60 color photographs. So for instance, we recently did a book on architecture in Michigan. We did one on the history of a locomotive. We did two books that have to do with military history in Michigan, heavily color illustrated, but in all cases, foundations supplied the money simply to pay for the color reproduction. But that's a different thing. That's not the author pulling it out of pocket.
No, I'm referring in particular to actually this publisher in New York, and actually the ad is on the local radio. If you like the local radio of Lansing, they are on the radio most of the time. They say Page Publishing.
They can afford it.
So I called the guy and I spoke to him. I said, what is the catch? Because I looked them up and they said,
Right.
well, you have to pay, it's not a lot of money. It's very little. It's like, let's say a total of $4,000. You pay them over like 9 months or 12 months. And then they say after that's on the first, let's say 100 copies or 200. And then after that you recoup whatever. So
No, what is fair, and some academic publishers will do this, is to ask you to take very minimal royalties or no royalties at all up till they have recuperated expenses. but not all of their expenses. It's not fair for a publisher who has to spend $50,000 to do a book or $15,000 to say that they need to recuperate all of that. It should be a percentage. They could say, you as the author, 10% of that, but you should have an exact figure. So you haven't expended anything, you just know that you're waiting until they've sold 900 books, and then from that moment you earn. But you're giving them the value added. It's your intellectual property. You shouldn't have to pay up front for that. Unless you're doing a vanity book because you want to do, a book of your grandchildren and give it out to friends. That's a different area.
Sorry, ignorant question, but the questionnaire about the questions to explain to the editor what your book is, why it's valuable, blah, blah, blah. I don't actually send that in. I write a prose version covering those questions.
There's two ways you can go about it. You can take those kinds of questions and you can adapt them into a prose version,
Okay.
or you can expand upon the very questions that are asked there.
Right.
Sometimes what we'll get is, we'll get a proposal that will be a cover letter that might be even 3 pages long, explaining where they're coming from and what the book is. If there's already a projected timeline and size, they'll give us that, and then they'll fill out the author questionnaire. And all those things together helps.
But
if the book is already ready, or largely ready, then you might also include a sample chapter, or maybe the introduction to the book, so
Okay.
they can get an idea.
So you don't mind if we fill out that questionnaire?
No, it's online.
Yeah,
It's
I mean, I
specifically
will,
there for you to do,
or for
but
other
not-
presses or whatever, because you don't do my subject, unfortunately, but
But
other
I think
presses.
you'll find that almost all presses have the same sort of thing. They'll
Yeah,
call by
they
a
don't
different
want
name.
you to write it in prose necessarily. It's easier just to answer their questions. Yes, no?
Well, as a preliminary, if you're just testing the waters, would you be interested? I would also always recommend, even after you've had feedback from an editor and somebody says that's interesting, do go to the next society meeting where you're at, the next conference that you're at, make an appointment and go talk with the editor, because that's a wonderful opportunity. Most good editors have a little dance card, as we call it, and every half hour is filled, and you're just sitting at the table and it's one author after another coming and giving you a pitch. Usually it's an author who has already written to you, and you're just got that opportunity to explain yourself better. So the follow-up is important as well. So either way, if one of the presses that you're contacting only want you to fill out the online form, fine.
Yeah, they just weren't clear. I've checked most of them, and I just didn't know how to do it, so this will help.
Sure.
And then where does, what's the definition of scholarly? Because my research is my own, and I've drawn on years of experience and teachers and stuff. Is that called a manual instead?
Well, the scholarly book, usually you're addressing your colleagues, and also it is aware of current literature. One of the reasons why we always ask to see a bibliography once you send in your full manuscript is we also need to know if you've kept up with the literature. That's very, very important in most fields.
Yeah, my field, there's no literature in this.
Oh, okay. Well,
So-
but see, you're addressing it from a different point of view.
But does
Then
that
you
still
have to-
count as scholarly?
No, but then what your decision is, would it be best served if it were published by a university press, given the network they have, how university presses reach out to universities, university libraries,
Right.
research libraries, and research events,
Right.
as opposed to
Right,
general
self-publishing or
public.
something.
Right.
Yeah, okay.
Self-publishing or even a trade publisher. So then at that point, you're thinking of the venue. Regardless of what your writing is, would it be better situated within an academic press?
That's
And
the
there you
question
look
I
at the
don't know,
catalog.
yeah.
There you look at the
So
catalog.
do I send them out and let them tell me the answer?
Sure.
Okay,
Send out exploratory letters and say, would this interest you?
okay.
And the ones that say, sure, send me something in, then you've started the conversation. We're done? Oh, yes.
Yeah, I have a question. Thank you very much for your excellent presentation. It was very helpful. Can you say a little bit about the editing process and actually finding a good editor, which can, I think, also make or break a book?
Okay, there's two levels there. Sometimes you might have some excellent content, but you feel you need heavy developmental editing. You really need someone to put it into shape. We've done 2 books like that in recent past. One of them had funding to actually have a professional ghostwriter, as it were. The ghostwriter didn't add any content at all. They took a very, very large amount of information and turned it into a really excellent narrative. And the author themselves admitted that they weren't, they had spent their life as an academic and as an administrator. weren't a writer, even though they'd given speeches and things like that. So that was something where we recommended a dual level. The professional writer worked directly with the author, but in communication with us so that they found out what our needs were. There are some presses that will assign developmental editing, but it's rare that this happens with the first book. It may happen if you're already published, but again, you do influential scholarship, but the way of presenting a book, for instance, if the press felt that they wanted your book to reach a broader audience for whatever reason, they might ask that some heavy developmental editing be done. In that case, the press would recommend it. If you want to have a finished product to present because you think you'll have a better chance of it, there are professional rewrite people, very, very skilled developmental editors. I happen to get usually maybe once every other week, somebody will offer their services to us and let us know. There was a person here on campus that was doing a history of one of the departments here at the university and asked if I could recommend someone. I had two names in mind because the people had written me. I don't use them as a press, but they had a very long curriculum of the works that they'd edited for other publishers. I put the two in contact and they were thrilled. So again, you'll find those sorts of people in that volume. Don't buy it, it's $399, but that volume, the volume about the literary marketplace, you'll find an entire section on people that do rewriting and developmental editing. If instead it's your press that has decided to take on the book, and this will more likely happen with a trade publisher than with a university press, because you're talking about a large budget there, tens of thousands of dollars to do something like that, but they may recommend the editor. So those are the levels at which you can approach this.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. I have a question for you regarding the if you have something that you've formally published, like a chapter or an article. What's the process if you were to revamp that chapter and or that article and to reintroduce it? Do you have to kind of completely change it for it to be included in the book? And my other question is regarding the editing. Do you recommend that the editing is done before it's shipped to the editor? Like the copy editing is done before or it's done afterwards?
We do the copy editing.
Okay.
The publisher does the copy editing, and you'll sometimes find that it's really, really very thorough. You might get, I had an example when I gave a different kind of presentation some years ago of a book that we had in African Studies, and it was the red-lined edit, and there were infinitely more balloons and words on the right-hand side than there were actual text, because to greatly improve it. So yeah, that's something that the press does, and it can sometimes become very, very thorough, unnerving, but it's for the good of the book. Again, as copy editing, as line editing, not as developmental editing, as someone that reshapes, you know, and says this paragraph ought to appear here, this there. It's usually, you know, the basic line editing, telling you if you repeated yourself, telling you if there's a lapse in logic, those sorts of things. As far as reutilizing material, no. I mean, quite often, and in some fields it's de rigueur, that you will have published what will become a chapter in another book. You will have published it, you will have gotten feedback, it will have appeared in a journal somewhere, and you might find that there's really nothing more to add, and you'll just plop it into a chapter. The only reason the publisher will want to know if that's happened before is if, pardon me, if they find that these things simultaneously live online in two different sources. You don't have to update it if it doesn't need to be. Often you'll find you may want to, if nothing more than adding an updated bibliography and a couple of more citations. But otherwise, that doesn't preclude accepting a book. I mean, we have published books where I would say as much as, let's imagine, 10 chapters, maybe 3 of them had already appeared elsewhere. That doesn't necessarily preclude the saleability of that book because it now becomes a complete, coherent unit.
Yeah, special situation. So I write a blog for an online like medical organization,
And initially, I signed a contract with them that it's their copyright. But I thought that I wrote so many, posts on that it may be worthwhile a book, and they're refusing to turn it into a book. So what can I do?
Well, okay, now the copyright is of the blog.
What's that?
Right? It's the blog. So it's the context and it's the way in which it's been presented. So if you just copied it and plopped it into another website and said, this is now mine, then you're in conflict.
No, I know that.
But the intellectual property of the content,
How can I convince them to turn it?
oh, to convince them to turn it into a book or another publisher? Well, you'll have to give it, you'll have to give it some other kind of organization, because a blog might be just a paragraph. It might be something that would be the equivalent of an essay. It might be a number of comments that make no sense unless you see the other comments. So you have to reshape it into a narrative that makes some sense. At which point you've basically rewritten it, it's a new book. But simply extrapolating the material wouldn't, right. Well, I don't know, even because the timeliness of blogs sometimes precludes the fact that they would make a good book that would last over the years. No doubt there is intellectual content that you provided there. It might be criticism, it might be commentary, it might be things about political actuality that you could extrapolate and revamp into the form of a book. A little work there, but you have to think of it no different than the conversation with the dissertation. It lived in one format, it had a purpose there, and simply extrapolating it wouldn't turn it into a book. You have to think in those terms. Thank you.